Shortly after George got involved in the project and got attached to direct the film, he was kind enough to give me a call, which surprised me, but really pleased me. And we had a long conversation about the book, and I was really heartened. It was very obvious talking to him on the phone that he not only had read the book, but that he really got it. He got the spirit of the book. He understood what the heart of the story was. And in fact, he talked about it in personal terms. He grew up quite poor in Kentucky. And so that helped him identify with this sort of ragtag bunch of kids that are at the heart of the story of the boys in the boat. And so he elaborated on how he personally felt connected to Joe Rance, who was the principal character in the story, and the hardship that Joe went through as a young man and as a boy. So as he was talking about that, I really felt that he was really in touch with what was most important about telling the story. These 9 young men are in many ways representative of their generation. They were hardscrabble kids growing up in very hard times. They had qualities that they had to acquire in order to survive: perseverance and a sort of relentless drive to get ahead, coping with hard circumstances, humility in the face of obstacles, a willingness to pull together and try to help each other. So I think a lot of those things are things that we've lost along the way, or we don't cultivate as much as we once did. So their story for me in many ways is representative of the struggle that whole generation of Americans went through. And that's certainly one of the things that attracts me to the story. And I think it's one of the things that attracted George Clooney to it as well. You know, in many ways, it's a feel-good story. It helps us feel good about ourselves as a people. It reminds us of what we're capable of when we pull together. It was one of the things that George mentioned when I talked to him the first time, and it's certainly one of the principal things that matters to me about the story. It's just, this is the right time, I think, for Americans to see a story like this. I think they're going to find it uplifting, inspiring, and I think they're going to come out of the theaters feeling good about being American. And there's a real hunger for this kind of story, a real hunger for stories about people working collaboratively, working with one another rather than against one another, and to use the metaphor of the book, simply pulling together. So I think there's a huge demand for that. I think there's a hunger for it. I do think everybody loves an underdog story, and this is a classic underdog story. In many ways, it reminds me of Seabiscuit, Laura Hillenbrand's book, which of course was this ragtag little horse that then nobody thought could win. The whole generation of Americans sort of fixated on Seabiscuit because that horse represented them in many ways. I think these 9 young men in the boat, in a very similar way, galvanized the attention of the nation because people felt they could identify with them. These were young working class men. They were the sons of farmers and fishermen and loggers. There was nothing pretentious about them. They were having a hard time making a way in the world. So it was easy, I think, during the Depression for Americans to see them as representative of themselves. You know, Joe was basically thrown away by his father and his stepmother. He was treated almost as disposable. He was left to fend for himself, living virtually in the woods as a teenager. And he had to find a way to make sense of his life and to find a place in the world, having been discarded so casually. My experience with readers of the book is that they're very drawn to Joe's story because it's a story of redemption and a story of how a vulnerable young man can find his way in the world through something like, in this case, crew, which gave him a purpose. It bonded him to other young men of his generation. So I think the Joe Rance story is very central to the way people respond to the story. Part of what's charming for me about the story is that these young men had essentially no rowing experience. To get where they wound up winning the Olympics, they had to row against their very good rivals at Cal Berkeley, but then they had to row against kids from the East Coast, kids who had almost grown up with oars in their hands, kids who'd gone to prep schools and who learned to row as adolescents or children even. These guys had no experience like that at all. The first time they climbed into a racing shell was in the 1930s when they joined the crew program. So it's all the more remarkable. And then they had to go on and defeat the British crew in Berlin. And again, you're talking about young men from Oxford and Cambridge who had gone to private, or what they call public schools in the UK and learned to row there. So all the way through their rowing careers, they were rowing against higher and harder levels of competition until they finally rowed against a Nazi crew in Germany.